The wind that swept the Caldwell mansion stood on a lonely stretch of land bordered by thick woods that few dared to enter. The locals often spoke of strange noises that echoed from within those trees, soft cries, faint laughter, and something that sounded like the fluttering of wings. When Margaret arrived, those sounds seemed to grow louder, more persistent, as if the forest itself recognized her return. For some believed she had lived there once before, long ago, before her marriage, when she was known only as the daughter of a physician infamous for his experiments in natural science and resurrection. Despite her wealth, Margaret had no interest in social gatherings or the polite company of Boston's elite. She turned away callers, refused invitations, and kept her daughters entirely out of public view. The townsfolk, curious and uneasy, began to invent stories. Some claimed she had gone mad from grief, others insisted she was performing dark rituals in memory of her husband. But none could deny the unsettling air that surrounded her estate, nor the way animals avoided the property altogether. In time, Margaret Caldwell's arrival became less a topic of gossip and more a quiet warning whispered among neighbors, the kind of story people told only when night had fallen and the wind began to move through the trees. It began as whispers in the marketplace, the kind that slipped easily between gossip and fear. The widow's arrival had already stirred curiosity, but soon the talk took a darker turn when people started claiming they had seen men entering the Caldwell estate long after the town had gone to sleep. A stable boy swore he spotted a figure, young and broad-shouldered, knocking at the iron gate just past midnight, only for the door to creak open and close behind him without a sound. Another villager, returning home from the tavern, said he saw lantern light flicker in the upper windows of the mansion, followed by a shadow passing across the curtains, a man's outline, moving swiftly and then vanishing. The next morning, the gate stood open, and muddy footprints led from the main road to the threshold before stopping abruptly, as if the earth itself had swallowed whoever made them. At first, these were nothing more than stories told for amusement. People said the widow was simply entertaining guests, perhaps suitors for her daughters or men tending to repairs on the sprawling, neglected estate. But as the nights grew colder and the moon hung low and red over the forest, the pattern repeated itself. Each time a young man was seen entering, he was never seen again. When a mother in the nearby village began searching for her missing son, a coal deliverer who had taken work at the Caldwell property, her pleas were met with silence from the widow's staff. Days later, the same woman found her son's cap snagged on a fence post near the edge of the woods, and a patch of earth beside it darkened as though by old blood. The whispers turned to fear. People began locking their doors before sunset, avoiding the road that passed the Caldwell estate altogether. The tavern became a gathering place for speculation. Some claimed the widow was running a secret brothel, others believed she was involved in something far more sinister. The doctor who had once served the Caldwell household refused to go near it again, claiming in a drunken outburst that what she calls life should never have been born. When questioned, he quickly recanted, trembling and pale. Even the sheriff hesitated to investigate, insisting there was no proof of wrongdoing. But the townspeople knew better. The men who went up to that mansion were healthy, strong, and full of life, and none ever returned. From the woods came the faintest echoes at night, cries carried on the wind, and beneath them, the sound of a woman's voice, soft, commanding, and unmistakably pleased, as if welcoming another guest into the darkness that thrived beyond her gates. As the year turned and the frost began to thaw from the trees, a new kind of notice began to appear across Boston. They were printed on fine parchment, the ink bold and deliberate, each one bearing the seal of the Caldwell estate. Healthy young men wanted for domestic service, it read. Good pay, private quarters, and generous benefits provided. To those struggling to survive the harsh economic times, it sounded like salvation. The widowed Margaret Caldwell, though reclusive, was known to be immensely wealthy, her husband's fortune tied to shipping and trade. To work in her mansion meant stability, coin in one's pocket, and the promise of advancement. Young men from the city, porters, apprentices, even students, began to talk eagerly about the opportunity, dismissing the rumors that had kept others away. The notices were said to appear overnight, pinned to tavern walls, market stalls, and church doors, as if placed by unseen hands. The widow herself was never seen in the city, but those who applied were met at the estate gates by her butler, a tall man with lifeless eyes who spoke little and asked many questions. He inspected the applicants carefully, noting their age, health, and family ties. It was said that those with no kin, no one to notice their absence, were the ones most likely to be hired. Each chosen man was told to report to the mansion before dusk, bringing only what he could carry. From that moment on, none of them was seen again. Curiosity grew when one of the notices reached the Boston Gazette, where a young journalist, intrigued by the bold promises, decided to inquire further. He traveled to the Caldwell estate and was turned away at the gate, the butler insisting there were no positions available. Yet behind the man's shoulder, the journalist claimed he saw movement, figures in white standing by the windows, watching him in utter stillness. Days later, he published a brief piece hinting at odd practices taking place on the estate, but before the paper could print a follow-up, he resigned suddenly and left the city altogether. For a while, the advertisements disappeared, and the townsfolk hoped the mystery had ended. But by late summer, new posters began to surface again, this time promising even greater rewards. The wages offered were enough to tempt even the most cautious souls. Mothers warned their sons not to go, but desperation often speaks louder than fear. One by one, men accepted the offer, walked the winding path into the woods toward the Caldwell mansion, and were never seen walking back out. The notices continued to appear, always clean, never weathered, as though the wind and rain refused to touch the words of a bargain struck with something not entirely human. Elias Turner was the first name the town remembered, though others had vanished before him. He was 22, broad-shouldered and full of life, the son of a blacksmith who had fallen on hard times after his father's death. When Elias saw the Caldwell notice posted near the docks, he believed it to be a chance to build a better future. He told his mother he would only be gone a week or two, just long enough to earn enough coin to help pay their rent. On a grey morning in early March, he packed his meager belongings and took the winding road that led through the forest toward the Caldwell estate. Several travelers saw him that day, walking briskly, humming to himself, unaware that every step carried him closer to the silence that waited beyond the trees. By the 7th day, when he had not returned or sent word, concern spread through the village. Elias's mother went to the estate, pleading at the gates, but the butler turned her away, saying no one by that name had ever been hired. She knew he was lying. Elias had shown her the parchment bearing the Caldwell seal. She returned the next day with the sheriff, who reluctantly followed her through the muddy road to the mansion. Margaret Caldwell greeted them herself, her tone polite but detached. She insisted she had never met the young man and that her household was fully staffed. When the sheriff asked to look around, she smiled faintly and said that no man of law could enter her home without a warrant. They left with nothing but a growing sense of unease. That night, the forest behind the Caldwell property seemed alive with sound, branches cracking, faint screams swallowed by the wind. 2 days later, a farmer found a torn coat near the edge of his field, the fabric stiff with dried blood. Inside the pocket was a brass button engraved with the initials ET word spread quickly, but no one dared to search the woods. As spring deepened, the estate grew even quieter. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no horses were seen leaving the stables, yet at night, lights flickered from room to room as if the house itself refused to rest. Some said they saw a figure moving near the forest's edge, walking unsteadily as if lost. When villagers went to investigate, they found nothing but disturbed earth and claw-like marks on the trees. Elias Turner's disappearance became the first of many, and though his mother continued to wait at her window each evening, hoping to see her son coming down the road, the only thing that returned from those woods was the echo of something that sounded like laughter, too faint and too cold to belong to any living man. It was in late April when word spread that a doctor had been summoned to the Caldwell estate. 4 months, the mansion had remained shrouded in secrecy, but one of the daughters, it was said, had fallen ill. The messenger who arrived at Dr. Thaddeus Green's clinic came cloaked in black, refusing to speak more than a few words. The widow's request was urgent, and the doctor, bound by duty and curiosity, agreed to make the journey. He was a man of science, rational to a fault, and though he had heard the rumors surrounding the Caldwell family, he dismissed them as nonsense born from provincial fear. He rode out at dusk, the sky dimming into bruised violet as the forest seemed to close around him. When Dr. Green arrived at the mansion, the great oak doors opened before he could knock, and the butler silently gestured for him to follow. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of iron and herbs, and the hallways were lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow his every move. He was led to an upper chamber where Margaret Caldwell awaited him, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. She thanked him for coming and explained that her youngest daughter, Emily, was suffering from severe fever and fits of weakness. But as he approached the bed, the doctor froze. The girl's skin was as white as paper, her veins faintly visible beneath the surface, and her breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. Her eyes opened briefly when he touched her wrist, and what stared back at him was something that made his heart falter. Her pupils were not fully human, reflecting the candlelight in an unnatural way, like the eyes of an animal caught in the dark. When he asked what treatments had already been attempted, the widow's answer was strange. She claimed to have given the girl a tonic derived from rare roots and a serum created by her late husband during his research into vitality. The doctor examined the vial she offered him, its contents a viscous crimson fluid that shimmered faintly, as though alive. He demanded to know its ingredients, but she only smiled and said it was a family secret. By the time Dr. Green left the mansion, dawn was breaking, and his hands trembled as he fumbled for his reins. The servants noticed the change in him. He looked pale, drenched in sweat, his eyes distant and haunted. When pressed to speak of what he saw, he refused. "That house," he whispered once in a tavern, "is not a home. It is a vessel." He would never return to the Caldwell estate again, and within weeks, he closed his practice and left Boston altogether. The townsfolk took it as confirmation of what they had long feared, that the sickness inside that mansion was not of the body, but of something far older, far darker, and beyond the reach of any medicine. The Caldwell household had few servants, and those who worked there rarely lasted more than a few weeks. They left without notice, pale and shaken, muttering that the mansion had eyes and that the walls whispered after midnight. One of them, a young maid named Nora Whitfield, was the only one brave enough to speak of what she had seen. She had come to work for Margaret Caldwell at 16, grateful for the high wages but unprepared for the silence that filled every corner of that house. The daughters, she said, were polite but strange. They moved soundlessly, their steps light as if they floated rather than walked, and they never ate during the family's lavish dinners. Nora would bring trays of food to their rooms, roast meat, soup, and bread, but when she returned in the morning, everything remained untouched. Only the water in their glasses would be gone, and even that carried a faint red tint, as though something had bled into it. At night, Nora often heard faint murmurs from behind their locked doors, a language she did not recognize, rhythmic and low, followed by the sound of weeping or laughter that didn't seem to belong to the girls she knew. One evening, she gathered the courage to peek through a narrow crack in the youngest daughter's door. What she saw froze her blood. Emily Caldwell was not in bed but kneeling before a mirror, her hands pressed against her stomach as she whispered softly to her reflection. The surface of the mirror rippled as if it were liquid, and something behind it moved, something that pressed outward, straining against the glass like a living thing. Nora ran, her screams echoing through the empty halls, but no one came. The next morning, the widow dismissed her quietly and handed her a sealed envelope of money, warning her never to speak of what she had witnessed. But Nora couldn't keep silent. When she returned to the village, she told the pastor that the Caldwell daughters were not sick, as everyone believed, they were changing. Their eyes gleamed faintly in darkness, their skin cold as marble, and something inside them was growing. She claimed that every time a man disappeared, one of the daughters fell ill for a few days, only to recover stronger, more radiant, and more detached from anything human. The pastor urged her to stay quiet, fearing the wrath of the wealthy widow, but rumors began to spread again. People whispered that Margaret Caldwell's daughters were not being treated for illness, they were being prepared. Whatever lived inside them was not of God or man, and the mother's fortune was being used not to protect them, but to feed whatever had taken root within their blood. By midsummer of 1852, the forest surrounding the Caldwell estate had become a place of fear and fascination. The townspeople called it Hollow Grove, though no one could remember who had first given it that name. It was said the woods were unnaturally still by day, as if the birds and insects had long abandoned them, but when night fell, the silence turned into something alive. Hunters returning from the deeper trails began to speak of sounds that didn't belong to any creature they knew, whispers that moved between the trees, low moans that rose and fell like breath, and once, the chilling cry of an infant echoing from somewhere deep within. Those who lingered too long in the forest came back disoriented, unable to recall where they had been or how much time had passed. A few claimed they had seen figures moving through the fog, human shapes that crawled instead of walked, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. The widow, meanwhile, forbade anyone from entering the woods behind her property, insisting it was private land. Yet her servants were seen carrying strange bundles into the forest at dusk, crates, burlap sacks, and once, what looked like a small coffin. When questioned, they denied everything, their faces pale and eyes distant. Some nights, lights could be seen flickering between the trees, pale blue and green, dancing as if in rhythm to some invisible song. The air carried an odd metallic scent, like blood left too long in the sun, and even the strongest men in town refused to pass near the Caldwell Road after dark. A trapper named Samuel Brigham was the first to ignore the warnings. Determined to discover what the widow was hiding, he entered the woods one night armed with a lantern and rifle. Hours later, his horse returned without him, its eyes wide with terror. Samuel's body was never found, though his rifle was discovered days later at the edge of a clearing, bent almost in half as if crushed by something enormous. The grass there was scorched in a perfect circle, and the soil beneath it hummed faintly when touched. After that, the townspeople began to say the forest itself had turned against them. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers, voices calling names, urging people to come closer. Children claimed they could see faces between the trees, pale and expressionless, watching the road toward the mansion. Some swore they had seen the Caldwell daughters wandering there at night, their white dresses glowing faintly under the moonlight, their hair loose and wild, moving as if guided by something unseen. And from the depths of Hollow Grove came a sound no one could ever explain, a heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing from the ground as if the earth itself was alive and waiting. The discovery of the letter came by accident, months after the first disappearances had begun to haunt the quiet outskirts of Boston. It was a clerk at the city archives who stumbled upon it, buried among a collection of maritime documents belonging to the late Mr. Thomas Caldwell. The parchment was yellowed, its ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, precise, elegant, and undeniably that of a man educated beyond his time. The letter was addressed to a Dr. Erasmus Heller of Salem, dated October 1851, just months before Mr. Caldwell's death at sea. It began innocuously, with talk of trade routes and financial accounts, but halfway through, the tone changed. "The experiments are proceeding," he wrote, "and Margaret has taken a keen interest in their success. I fear her fascination has surpassed even my own, and I am no longer certain who truly leads this pursuit." What followed was far darker. Caldwell described work involving the regeneration of flesh and the preservation of vitality beyond mortal decay. He mentioned that samples had been obtained from donors of robust constitution and combined with maternal agents capable of sustaining transformation. The phrasing was cryptic, scientific, but the implications were horrifying. Caldwell and his wife had been conducting experiments on human fertility, attempting to merge life and death into something eternal. He claimed success was near, noting that the early subjects exhibited remarkable endurance, though none yet survived the full process. The final line read, "If my vessel does not return from its final voyage, Margaret will know what to do." When the clerk shared his discovery with a local historian, the letter was quietly passed to the authorities, but before any official inquiry could begin, it vanished from the record. Some said Margaret Caldwell herself bribed those involved to keep it secret, others whispered that the clerk who found it had gone missing within a week. Still, a copy of the letter's transcription circulated quietly through Boston's academic circles, terrifying those who read it. Physicians and scholars who examined the text agreed that Caldwell's research hinted at unnatural experiments meant to create life without divine sanction, children born not of human conception but of deliberate scientific interference. The knowledge of the letter spread through the town like a sickness. The people now believed the widow's fortune had not come from her husband's trade, but from the results of his forbidden work. If she had indeed continued his research after his death, then the purpose of her isolation and the strange recruitment of young men became all too clear. She was not mourning a lost husband, she was completing his work, guided by notes written in a dead man's hand and the unholy promise that what they had created could never truly die. By the time autumn settled over Boston in 1852, the Caldwell mansion had grown eerily quiet. The once faint signs of life, the dim lanterns in the upper windows, the carriages that came and went at midnight, had ceased. Only the crows gathered now on the rooftops, their cries cutting through the chill air like omens. It was then that word spread through the remaining servants that the youngest daughter, Emily, was with child. The announcement was not made publicly, it leaked through whispers among those who still dared to deliver supplies to the estate. The widow, they said, had dismissed almost all her staff and ordered that the estate's gates remain locked day and night. But through the barred iron fence, some had seen her pacing the gardens under the moonlight, speaking softly to herself as though in prayer or command. Unlike her sisters, Emily had always appeared the weakest. Her mother's obsession with her sudden condition struck everyone as strange. The widow summoned midwives from distant towns, none of whom ever stayed long. Some fled before nightfall, claiming the girl's pregnancy was unnatural, that her pulse beat in 2 rhythms instead of 1. One midwife, before vanishing from Boston altogether, confided to a local priest that she had placed her ear to Emily's belly and heard not the movement of a human child, but a sound like the faint hum of wings. She swore that Margaret Caldwell forbade her to pray aloud during the examination, saying, "Faith is what brought death to mankind. Science will bring it back." As Emily's condition worsened, the widow grew more desperate. She began sending her servants into the forest with strange requests: fresh animal blood, herbs used in ancient rituals, and wood from trees that had been struck by lightning. On the night of the harvest moon, neighbors claimed to see torches flickering deep within Hollow Grove. They heard chanting carried on the wind, a woman's voice rising and breaking with a kind of frenzied devotion. The townsfolk knew it was the widow and her daughters, but none dared to intervene. When the blood moon rose weeks later, it was said Margaret led her daughter into the woods herself. Some swore they saw the 2 figures, pale and spectral, moving through the mist with lanterns that glowed red like fireflies. No one knows what happened that night, but afterward, the forest changed. The ground was soft as if newly turned, and the air carried a stench of decay that no rain could wash away. The widow returned alone the next morning, her dress torn and stained dark. From that night on, no one ever saw Emily again, though some swore they heard the cry of an infant echo through the trees whenever the moon turned red. When the families of the missing men finally pooled their suspicions and their grief, they hired a private investigator from New York, a man named Jonathan Harker, known for his relentless pursuit of truth, even when it led him into the darkest corners of society. He arrived in Boston during the final weeks of winter, when the Caldwell estate stood silent under a crust of frost, its chimneys long cold and its windows black. The villagers warned him to stay away, telling him stories of the screams that came from the woods and the strange lights that glowed where no fire should burn, but Harker was not a man easily frightened. He began by visiting the local archives, where he unearthed the surviving correspondence between Margaret and her late husband. The words confirmed what rumor had only dared to suggest, that the widow had continued the experiments her husband began, and that young men had indeed been used as donors in her pursuit of creating new life. Armed with this, he made his way to the estate one moonless night, carrying a lantern, a pistol, and a small leather-bound Bible. The gates were chained but unlocked, as though someone expected him. The mansion loomed ahead, its once grand walls now blanketed in vines and mildew. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and old iron. Harker moved carefully through the halls, noting the silence, too complete, too unnatural. Every portrait seemed to watch him as he passed. Dust lay thick on the furniture, but the hearth in the main parlor still held the faintest glow of embers, as if recently disturbed. It was when he reached the basement door that he heard it, a faint sound, rhythmic and wet, like something breathing beneath the floor. He forced the door open and descended into darkness. What he found below the mansion would haunt him until his final breath. The cellar was not a storage space but a nursery of horrors. Along the stone walls were rows of cradles, each draped in rotted cloth. Some contained bones small enough to be children's, others shapes too twisted to name. In the center of the room stood a wooden cradle larger than the rest, its lining soaked through with something black and dry. Beneath it, the earth had been dug out, forming a pit that seemed to pulse faintly when his lantern drew near. Harker stumbled back, realizing the soil itself was moving, breathing, as if the ground was alive. He fled the estate before dawn, his sanity frayed, his faith shattered. When he returned to the city and reported what he had seen, no one believed him. But months later, when the mansion finally burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances, the fire refused to die for 3 days, and among the ashes, the only thing found intact was a single cradle empty, yet still warm to the touch.